My name is Reese. I'm 28 years old, and for my entire life, my mother looked at me like a stain on her expensive rug. She just told me she wishes I were never born, but as I stood up to walk away, I wasn't crying. I was smiling, because I'm about to show her exactly how much that mistake is going to cost her. The rain didn't just fall in Greenwich, it hammered against the leaded glass windows of the estate like 1,000 tiny fingers trying to claw their way in. Inside, the air smelled of expensive lilies and the sharp, medicinal sting of my mother's gin and tonic. I sat on the edge of the velvet armchair in the library, my fingers tracing the frayed hem of my black sweater. My father had been buried less than 4 hours ago. The soil on my shoes was still damp, a dark stain against the cream-colored Persian rug. "For heaven's sake, Reese, stop fidgeting," my mother snapped. Eleanor stood by the fireplace, the orange glow of the embers catching the sharp lines of her bobbed hair. She didn't look like a grieving widow. She looked like a woman who had just finished a long, tedious business transaction and was ready to collect her commission. She took a slow sip of her drink, the ice cubes clinking against the glass, a cold, rhythmic sound that grated on my nerves. "I was just thinking about Dad," I said, my voice sounding small in the cavernous room, "about how much he loved this library." "Your father loved status, Reese. This library was just a backdrop for his ego." She turned, her eyes sweeping over me with a familiar, lingering look of disappointment. She lingered on my shoulder-length blonde hair, which I hadn't had the heart to style that morning. "And look at you. You've let yourself go entirely. I suppose the caregiver role was a convenient excuse to stop trying." The words stung, but I was used to the venom. For the last 5 years, while my father's health faded, I had been the one holding his hand, managing his medications, and listening to his stories. Eleanor had been traveling, which was her code for staying at luxury hotels in Palm Beach to avoid the depressing reality of a sick room. "I did it because I loved him, Mom," I said softly. Eleanor let out a short, sharp laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Love, such a quaint word for someone with no prospects. You've spent your best years playing nursemaid, and for what? You have no career, no husband, and frankly, no style." She set her glass down on the mahogany mantel with a definitive thud. "The funeral is over, Reese. The mourning period is officially closed. Tomorrow I start the renovations. This house is far too heavy for a woman of my tastes. I'm thinking white marble, open spaces, and definitely fewer books." I looked around at the thousands of volumes my father had curated. "You're getting rid of his books?" "I'm getting rid of everything that doesn't serve me," she said, her voice dropping to a cold, predatory whisper. "And that includes the dead weight." She walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to flick a piece of lint off my shoulder. "Go to bed, Reese. Tomorrow is a very big day. For me, at least." I watched her leave, the scent of her Chanel No. 5 lingering in the air like a threat. I reached up and smoothed my hair, my heart thudding against my ribs. She thought I was broken. She thought I was the same mousy girl who had spent 5 years in the shadows. But as I looked at the dark window reflecting my own pale face and blonde hair, I didn't cry. I just took a deep breath and waited. The sun didn't shine the next morning. It glared. It bounced off the white morning room walls, making my head throb as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. I hadn't slept. I had spent the night in my father's study, sitting in his leather chair, breathing in the fading scent of peppermint and old paper. The door to the study swung open. Eleanor stood there, dressed in a sharp, cream-colored pantsuit, holding a stack of heavy-duty black trash bags. "Why are you still in here?"
she asked, her voice tight. I hired the decorators to come at noon for the measurements. This room needs to be cleared. It's 7 in the morning, Mom, I said, my voice raspy. At least let me go through his personal papers first. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked over to the bookshelf, grabbed a handful of framed family photos, and swept them into a trash bag. The sound of the glass cracking inside the plastic was like a gunshot in the quiet room. What are you doing? I stood up, my heart racing. Those are our photos. That's the trip to Maine. That's my graduation. They're clutter, Reese, she said, not even looking at me. She moved to the desk and began dumping the contents of the drawers, pens, stationery, my father's favorite magnifying glass, into the bag. I'm modernizing. I don't need reminders of a life that's over, and neither do you. She stopped and looked me up and down. My blonde hair was messy, and I was still wearing the clothes from yesterday. I want you out by tonight, she said flatly. The air left my lungs. Tonight? Dad's only been gone a few days. I haven't even looked for an apartment. I've been busy with the arrangements, with playing the martyr, she interrupted. She walked toward me, the black plastic bag trailing behind her like a heavy tail. Let's be honest, Reese. You stayed here because you had nowhere else to go. You're a 28-year-old woman with a half-finished degree and a resume that says nurse for a man who's dead. You were a parasite. I took care of him because you wouldn't, I shouted, the anger finally breaking through. He was your husband. Eleanor's face contorted. The mask of the polished socialite slipped, revealing something jagged and ugly underneath. She stepped into my personal space, a smell of her expensive hairspray clashing with the dust she'd kicked up. You're a paycheck, she hissed, and you were a mistake I had to live with for nearly 30 decades. I spent 28 years watching my body change, my freedom vanish, and my youth slip away because of you. Your father only kept you around because he felt guilty for what your birth did to my life. She leaned in closer, her eyes cold as winter ice. I wish you were never born, Reese. Truly, it would have saved me so much trouble. The room went dead silent. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant chirp of a bird outside. For a second, I felt the old familiar sting, the urge to curl up and apologize for existing. But then I remembered the conversation I'd had in this very room 6 months ago. I remembered the heavy weight of the folder my father had handed me. I looked at Eleanor, really looked at her. I saw the desperation behind her jewelry and the fear behind her cruelty. Slowly, I stood up. I smoothed my shoulder-length hair and looked her right in the eye. And then I did the one thing she didn't expect. I smiled. It wasn't a small, shy smile. It was wide, bright, and terrifyingly calm. "What is wrong with you?" Eleanor recoiled, her brow furrowing. "I just told you I hate you, and you're standing there grinning like an idiot." "I'm not grinning, Mom," I said, my voice steady and light. "I'm just realizing that for the first time in my life, we finally agree on something." "And what's that?" "That from this moment on," I said, picking up my purse from the desk, "I don't have a mother." I walked past her, my shoulder brushing hers. I didn't look back at the trash bags or the broken glass. I walked out of the library, down the grand staircase, and straight out the front door into the crisp morning air. I didn't have a suitcase, and I didn't have a plan where to sleep, but as I reached the end of the long graveled driveway, my smile only grew. Eleanor thought she had just thrown out the trash. She had no idea she'd just handed me the keys to the kingdom. I didn't go far. I drove my beat-up 2018 crossover, the one Eleanor always called an eyesore in the driveway, to a small 24-hour diner 3 towns over. It was the kind of place where the air smelled permanently of burnt toast and industrial-grade maple syrup. The vinyl booths were cracked and taped over with duct tape, and the waitress didn't care that my eyes were slightly bloodshot or that my blonde hair was a mess from the wind. I ordered a black coffee, the strongest they had. When it arrived, I didn't drink it immediately. I just let the steam warm my face, a stark contrast to the air-conditioned frost of the estate. From my purse, I pulled out a plain manila folder. It was thin, unassuming, and slightly crinkled at the edges. To anyone else, it looked like junk mail. To Eleanor, it didn't exist. I opened it and looked at the business card stapled to the inside flap. Marcus Harrison, Estates and Private Trusts. Beneath the card was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in my father's shaky, elegant script. It was dated 6 months ago, the night Eleanor had been in St. Bart's for a wellness retreat, while Dad was coughing up blood in the next room. "Reese," the note began, "you are the only one who stayed. You are the only one who truly knows what it means to be a Sterling. Your mother thinks she knows the shape of my soul because she knows the size of my bank account. She is wrong. Do not be afraid when the time comes. Smile, because you are the one holding the smallest key to the biggest door." I remembered that night. My father had looked so frail, his skin like parchment paper, but his eyes had been sharp, sharper than I'd seen them in years. He'd made me swear to keep this folder in my car, away from the house. He'd made me promise not to show it to the family lawyer, a man who played golf with Eleanor twice a month. My phone buzzed on the table. It was an alert from the shared family account, a notification I hadn't yet been removed from. Transaction, $45,000. Payee, North Cove Yacht Sales. I stared at the screen. A bitter laugh escaped my throat, drawing a look from a trucker in the next booth. Eleanor wasn't even waiting for the body to be cold. She was already spending the inheritance she assumed was hers. She was buying a yacht with money that, according to the documents I'd spent the last 6 months helping my father reorganize, didn't actually belong to her. She thought she was the queen of the chessboard. She didn't realize I'd been playing for the king since the day she stopped checking on him. I tapped the business card. It was time to call Marcus. "Mr. Harrison," I said when the line picked up, "it's Reese Sterling. My father was buried today." There was a pause, a heavy silence filled with the weight of what was about to happen. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Reese," Marcus said, his voice gravelly and kind. "I assume Eleanor has already started making adjustments?" "She gave me until tonight to move out. She told me I was a mistake." "Then I suppose she's in for a very expensive correction. The official reading is set for tomorrow at 10 a.m. I've already sent the notice to her counsel. Are you ready?" I looked at the note from my father one last time. I thought about the trash bags, the sound of the glass breaking and the ice clinking in my mother's glass. "I've been ready for 5 years," I said. I hung up, took a long sip of the bitter, hot coffee, and felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the mistake in the room. I was the architect. I spent the night at a motel off Route 1. It was a place where the walls were painted the color of old oatmeal, and the air smelled of lemon-scented bleach and stale cigarette smoke. It was a far cry from the high thread count sheets and the silence of the Sterling estate. But as I sat on the edge of the stiff bed, I felt more at home here than I ever had in Greenwich. I opened my laptop. My father had taught me a lot about the family business during those long nights when he couldn't sleep. While Eleanor was out at galas, I was learning about liquidity, offshore trusts, and the specific way she liked to funnel household expenses into her personal boutique accounts. I logged into the social media accounts I usually avoided. I didn't have to scroll far. Eleanor had posted a photo an hour ago. She was standing on the deck of a sleek white yacht, the one she'd just put a down payment on, holding a glass of champagne. The caption read, "New beginnings, finally breathing again, #fresh start, #new chapter." She was celebrating the death of the man who had provided everything for her. She was celebrating the riddance of her daughter. My phone chimed again, a text from an unknown number. "The paperwork is finalized. I've secured the digital copies. See you at 10, Reese. Wear something they won't expect." I looked at the small suitcase I'd packed before Eleanor had started her rampage. Inside was a navy blue blazer and a crisp white shirt. It was a suit I'd bought with the small allowance my father had given me specifically for emergencies. I stood in front of the warped motel mirror. I looked at my shoulder-length blonde hair. It was a bit wild from the stress, but my eyes, blue like my father's, were steady. I spent 20 minutes brushing my hair until it fell in a smooth, professional line around my face. I practiced the smile again, not the one of a grieving daughter, but the one of a woman who was about to settle a very old debt. The weight of the motel key in my pocket felt significant. It was plastic, cheap, and temporary. Tomorrow, I wouldn't need it. I laid out my clothes for the morning. I checked the manila folder one last time, ensuring the codicil was tucked safely in the middle. My father had been a man of many secrets, but his greatest one was his belief in me. He knew Eleanor would try to erase me the moment he was gone. He'd counted on it. "You wanted me to never to have been born, Mom, but I'm the only thing you're going to have to deal with for a long, long time." I didn't sleep much, but for the first time in years, the insomnia wasn't born of anxiety. It was the hum of adrenaline. The mousy girl was staying in the motel. The architect was going to the will reading. The drive back to the estate felt different. The gravel driveway didn't feel like a path to a prison anymore. It felt like a runway. As I pulled up, I saw a white van parked near the side entrance. "Interior renovations and design," the gold lettering on the side read. Eleanor hadn't even waited 24 hours to start gutting the place. I stepped out of my car, smoothing the lapels of my navy blazer. My blonde hair was tucked neatly behind my ears, sharp and precise. I took a breath of the crisp Connecticut air and walked toward the front door. I didn't use my key. I rang the bell. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, who looked like she'd been crying for 3 days straight, opened the door. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "Oh, Miss Reese, you look wonderful." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. Is everyone in the dining room?" "Yes, dear. Your mother is she's in a hurry." I nodded and walked past her. The scent of fresh white paint already hung in the foyer, clashing with the lingering smell of my father's old books. It made my stomach turn, but I kept my face a mask of cool indifference. I entered the dining room. Eleanor was seated at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a black silk dress that cost more than my car. She was laughing at something her lawyer, Mr. Aristotle, was saying. Aristotle was a man who looked like he was made of expensive leather and polished teeth. When I walked in, the laughter died. Eleanor's eyes swept over my suit, her lips curling into a sneer. "Well, look who found a costume. I'm surprised you didn't come in your pajamas, considering you're living in a motel now. I assume that's why you smell like cheap detergent?" "Good morning, Eleanor," I said, my voice projecting with a strength that made Mr. Aristotle blink. I didn't sit in my usual chair at the side. I walked to the very end of the table. opposite her. "Who is this?" Eleanor asked, gesturing toward the man who had followed me in. Marcus Harrison stepped forward. He wasn't wearing a flashy suit like Aristotle. He wore a charcoal gray wool coat and carried a battered briefcase that looked like it had seen the inside of 100 courtrooms. "Marcus Harrison," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I'm here representing the interests of Reese Sterling." Aristotle chuckled, a dry, patronizing sound. "Marcus, I haven't seen you since the probate hearings in '09. I didn't realize you were still practicing. Reese, dear, this is a family meeting. There's no need for outside counsel. Your father's affairs are quite straightforward." "Are they?" I asked, leaning back in the chair. The wood felt cold against my spine. Eleanor waved a hand dismissively. "Let's just get this over with. I have a luncheon at the club at 1, and the contractor needs my signature on the marble for the foyer. Aristotle, read the document so we can send Reese on her way." Aristotle cleared his throat and opened a thick leather folder. "As per the last will and testament of Thomas Sterling, dated 3 years ago, the bulk of the estate, including the Greenwich property, the Manhattan penthouse, and all liquid assets, are to be bequeathed to his wife, Eleanor Sterling." Eleanor smirked at me, tapping her manicured nails against the table. Click, click, click. "To his daughter, Reese Sterling, the sum of $500,000 is to be placed in a restricted trust accessible at the age of 35. $500,000, Eleanor scoffed. Thomas was always too generous with his guilt. But fine, she can have her pittance in 7 years. She stood up, reaching for her handbag. "Is that all? I really must get to the club." "Not quite," Marcus Harrison said. He hadn't sat down. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a single thin sheet of paper encased in a plastic sleeve. "There is the matter of the codicil." Eleanor froze. Her hand stopped inches from her bag. "The what?" "A codicil," Marcus repeated, sliding the paper across the long mahogany table. It slid perfectly, stopping right in front of Aristotle. The room went deathly quiet. I watched Eleanor's face. The confidence didn't vanish all at once. It eroded second by second as she watched Aristotle's tan face go a sickly shade of gray. "This," Aristotle stammered, his eyes darting across the page, "this can't be right." "I assure you it is," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. "Check the signature, Mr. Aristotle. It was verified by his doctor to ensure he was of sound mind." I looked at Eleanor. She was staring at me, her chest beginning to heave. "What does it say? Read it."
Mr. Aristotle's hands were shaking so violently the paper rattled like dry leaves in a storm. He cleared his throat, but the sound that came out was a thin, strangled croak. He looked at Eleanor, then back at the document, his tan face now the color of curdled milk. "Read it, author," Eleanor barked, slamming her hand onto the table. Her heavy diamond rings made a sharp, ugly crack against the wood. "Read that piece of garbage so we can throw this man out." Aristotle took a shuddering breath. "I, Thomas Sterling, being of sound mind, do hereby amend my previous wishes. Due to documented evidence of financial mismanagement, gross negligence of marital duties, and," he paused, swallowing hard, "and the repeated flagrant violations of the morality clause within our prenuptial agreement, I hereby revoke all previous bequests to my wife, Eleanor Sterling." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't move. She just sat there, her mouth slightly open, looking like a statue that was starting to crack. "In lieu of the estate," Aristotle continued, his voice barely a whisper, "Eleanor Sterling is to receive a one-time final payment of $10,000,
This sum is provided solely to ensure she has the means to secure immediate alternate housing. 10,000? Eleanor's voice was a ghost of a sound. $10,000? That wouldn't even cover the rug in the foyer. There's more, Marcus Harrison said softly. He gestured for Aristotle to finish. The entirety of the Sterling holdings, Aristotle read, his eyes fixed on the paper as if he were looking at his own death warrant, including all real estate, the international investment portfolio, and the controlling interest in Sterling Development, are to be bequeathed immediately and solely to my daughter, Reese Sterling. Furthermore, Eleanor Sterling is granted 24 hours from the time of this reading to vacate all Sterling properties. All access to shared accounts is hereby terminated. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I watched a single bead of sweat roll down Mr. Aristotle's temple. I looked at my mother. The transformation was horrific. The polished, elegant woman I had grown up fearing was gone. In her place was something feral. Her eyes darted to me, turning a bloodshot, venomous red. "You," she hissed. The word was thick with spit. "You did this. You manipulated him. You sat in that room with him while he was drugged up on morphine, and you whispered lies into his ear." "He wasn't on morphine when he signed that, Mom," I said, my voice sounding like cool water over stones. "He was sharper than he'd been in years. He saw the credit card statements. He saw the photos of you in St. Bart's with your yoga instructor. He saw the way you looked at him, like he was a bill that was taking too long to be paid." Eleanor lunged across the table. She didn't reach me. Marcus Harrison moved with a surprising speed, stepping between us. "I'll sue!" she screamed, her voice hitting a frequency that made the crystal glasses on the sideboard ring. "This is a fraud. You're a nothing, Reese. You're a mousy, pathetic little girl. You can't run a company. You can't even run a bath." I stood up slowly. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to defend myself. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. I set it on the table and pushed it toward her. It was the black plastic trash bag she had used to throw away my father's photos yesterday. "I think you'll need these," I said. "You have 24 hours to fill them, though according to the codicil, you're only allowed to take your clothing and personal effects. The jewelry my father bought you, the furs, those stay. They're part of the estate now." Eleanor looked at the trash bags, then back at me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You were never born," she repeated, the words coming out as a jagged sob. I looked at her, really looked at her for the last time. I felt a strange pang of pity, but it was quickly swallowed by the memory of the glass breaking in the library. I smiled. "I know, Mom, but as it turns out, I was the only thing in this house you should have been afraid of."
The dining room felt like it was tilting on its axis. Eleanor stood paralyzed, staring at the black plastic bags as if they were venomous snakes. Mr. Aristotle was already backing toward the door, his briefcase clutched to his chest like a shield. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one, and he'd already spent his career watching Eleanor's moral compass spin aimlessly. "Arthur, do something!" Eleanor hissed, her voice cracking. "There's nothing to do, Eleanor," Aristotle muttered, not looking her in the eye. "The signatures are ironclad. The morality clause was specific. I'll send you my final bill." He vanished into the hallway, his footsteps quick and hollow. I didn't stay to watch Eleanor's next breakdown. I had work to do. I walked out of the dining room and straight toward the foyer. The two men from the renovation company were leaning against the white van parked near the porch, sharing a cigarette and looking at a clipboard. "Excuse me," I said. My voice didn't shake. It carried over the gravel, sharp and clear. The lead contractor, a man with a thick neck and a no-nonsense cap, looked up. "Yeah, we're waiting for Mrs. Sterling to sign off on the marble delivery." "There's been a change in management," I said, stopping a few feet from them.
The renovation is canceled. All of it. The contractor frowned. Look, lady, we have a contract. We've already started the prep work in the library. I'm Reese Sterling, the owner of this estate. My lawyer will be in touch to pay for the hours you've worked today, but you are to pack your tools and leave this property within the hour. If you touch a single book or a piece of molding on your way out, it will be considered a criminal act. The contractor looked past me into the house, likely seeing the carnage of Eleanor's ego. He shrugged, flicked his cigarette into the gravel, and whistled to his partner. All right, boys, pack it up. Work's canceled. I watched them go, the heavy sliding door of the van slamming shut with a satisfying clunk. I turned back to the house. The grand entrance, which had always felt like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole, now felt just like a house. Wood, stone, and glass. I walked into the library. It was a mess. Half-filled trash bags were slumped against the mahogany shelves. My father's graduation photo lay on the floor, the glass shattered. I knelt down, ignoring the sharp sting as a small shard pricked my thumb. I picked up the photo. My father was smiling, his arm around a much younger, much less tired version of me. Reese. I didn't turn around. I knew the sound of those heels. Eleanor stood in the doorway. She wasn't screaming anymore. She looked small, her expensive dress hanging off her shoulders as if she'd suddenly lost 10 pounds of sheer arrogance. "Reese, honey," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet tone I hadn't heard since I was 5 years old. "We're both upset. We're grieving. Your father, he wasn't himself at the end. We can fix this. We can sit down, just the two of us, and talk about a fair way to split things. You've always been such a sensitive, caring girl." I stood up, holding the broken photo to my chest. I looked at her, the woman who'd told me 12 hours ago that I was a mistake. "You're right, Mom. I am sensitive. I remembered every word you said. I remembered the ice in your glass while Dad was dying. I remembered you calling me a parasite. I was stressed." She reached out, her hand trembling. "No," I said, stepping back. "You were honest, and now I'm being honest. You have 23 hours and 40 minutes left. I've already called a security team. They'll be stationed at the gates. They have a list of what you're allowed to take. If you try to walk out with the sterling emeralds or the silver, they will stop you." "You wouldn't," she whispered. "I already did. And Mom, don't bother going to the club for lunch. I've already called and revoked your charging privileges. I hear the motel off Route 1 has a very decent vending machine." The color drained from her face again, a dull, flat gray. She realized then that there was no sensitive girl left to manipulate. The daughter she had tried to bury was the one who was now holding the shovel. I walked past her, my boots clicking firmly on the hardwood. I had one more stop to make before the sun went down. The clock in the foyer struck 10. The sound echoed through the hollowed-out hallways of the estate, a heavy, rhythmic toll that marked the end of an era. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching the front door. I'd swapped the navy blazer for one of my father's old oversized cashmere sweaters. It was soft, smelled faintly of cedar, and felt like a suit of armor. Below me, 2 men in professional black suits, the security team Marcus had recommended, stood like sentinels by the entrance. Then came the sound of heels, but they weren't the confident, rhythmic clicks of the Eleanor Sterling I knew. They were dragging, heavy and uneven. Eleanor appeared from the hallway leading to the master suite. She was clutching 3 black trash bags, the very ones she had tossed at me. Her hair, usually a perfect architectural feat, was limp. She hadn't put on makeup. Without her mask, she looked every bit her age, her face lined with a bitterness that no amount of cream could ever smooth away. "The car is waiting, Eleanor," I said from the landing. She stopped and looked up. For a second, I saw a flash of the old fire in her eyes. but it was quickly snuffed out by the side of the security guards. "You're really doing this. You're throwing your own mother out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back. You have $10,000, your wardrobe, and your dignity if you can find where you left it. That's more than you gave me when you told me to leave." As she reached the door, one of the guards stepped forward, holding a gloved hand out. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I need to check the bags." "How dare you!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice cracking. "These are my personal belongings." "It's my house, Eleanor," I said, walking slowly down the stairs, "and those are my rules." The guard opened the first bag. He reached in and pulled out a heavy, velvet-lined box. He opened it to reveal the sterling sapphires, a set my father had bought for their 20th anniversary. He looked up at me. "That stays," I said. "He gave those to me." Eleanor lunged for the box, but the guard shifted it out of her reach. "He gave those to his wife," I corrected her, "the woman he thought existed. According to the codicil, any gift valued over $5,000 purchased with sterling funds remains with the estate due to the breach of the morality clause. Drop the box, Mom." She looked like she wanted to spit on me. Instead, she let out a jagged, pathetic sob and let the bag slip from her fingers. She didn't fight him on the second bag, which contained a fur coat, or the third, which had several pieces of silver. By the time the guards were finished, she was left with 2 small suitcases and the clothes she was wearing. One of the guards opened the heavy oak front door. The bright morning sun poured into the foyer, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, a simple rideshare car was idling at the curb. Not a limo, not a town car, just a gray sedan. Eleanor walked to the threshold. She paused, looking back at the portraits, the marble, and finally at me. "You'll fail," she whispered, her voice trembling with a final desperate curse. "You're just like him. You'll die alone in this big empty house, surrounded by books that can't love you back." "Maybe," I said, stepping toward her, "but I'll die knowing that I was the daughter he deserved, and I'll die in a house that actually belongs to me." I reached out and placed my hand on the cold brass handle of the door. "Goodbye, Eleanor. I hope you find whatever it is you were looking for in St. Bart's, because you won't find it here." I closed the door. The thud was final. I heard the faint sound of the car gravel crunching as the sedan pulled away. The house was silent, truly silent. For the first time in 28 years, the air didn't feel heavy with judgment. I walked back into the library. The sun was hitting the shelves, turning the leather spines of the books into a wall of gold. I went to the desk and picked up the photo I had found the day before. I sat in my father's chair, took a deep breath, and set the photo down in the center of the desk. I pulled a small screwdriver from the drawer and carefully removed the broken glass, clearing away the shards until the image of us was clean and bright. I looked at my reflection in the window. My shoulder-length blonde hair caught the light. I looked tired, yes. I looked like a woman who had been through a war. But as I stood up and looked out over the sprawling green lawn that was now mine, I realized Eleanor was wrong. I wasn't a mistake. I was the plan. I leaned against the window frame and watched a hawk circle high above the trees, free and wild. I smiled, and this time there was no one left to tell me to stop.